All right. Seeing that okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, with that, I'll take it away. I want to thank Alita for the invitation. It's definitely a special moment for me to give a talk here because this is one of the places that I kind of got my birding origin. So I started grad school at U of I way back in 2011. And just before that, I started birding with the Audubon Society here, honing my skills with birds. So it's nice to be able to come back and give a talk about some of the research that I've been doing. So today I'm going to talk about the importance of natural history and citizen science. And currently I am a postdoc at the University of Illinois. All right. So before we get started, I just want to thank all the collaborators who were a part of this research. These include many people like Dr. Mark Hauber and Jeff Braun, who are at the University of Illinois, and also our very own Zach Sutton, who you might be able to see here in the bottom left, who's one of my best friends and also a staple of the area in East Central Illinois birding community. So just want to thank everybody who's involved and also all the citizen scientists and natural historians around the world who collect all of these important data. So natural history is defined as the observation of plants and animals in their natural environments. And this is something I think that most people can relate to. I think that everybody's had some sort of moment where you're outside and you see an animal or even a plant do something really cool and you think, wow, that's an interesting behavior. That's an interesting sort of natural history fact. I wonder why that is. And this goes all the way back to even ancient Roman times. This was Pliny the Elder wrote in the 1st century AD, Historia Naturalis. And we've also, had sort of a rich history of natural historians, many of whom have achieved prominence in the science world, such as Jane Goodall, just being one example. So naturalists from yesteryear and today are, still collecting data and observing animals and trying to understand why they behave the way that they do. Natural history, I will argue, is an incredibly important part of the sort of scientific process. And if you think about science, there's sort of this dichotomy. There's the observational method and there's the experimental method. And natural history is an example of the observational method. You see something interesting and then you analyze it and you try to understand why it might be, and you can generate hypotheses to figure out why an animal is doing such a thing. And it's important because these hypotheses can then be used and sort of plugged into the second column that you see, or the experimental method, to try to manipulate that system to understand why animals are doing what they're doing. In addition to the sort of being this fundamental part of the scientific process, observing animals sort of connects us to the natural world, and it kind of helps us understand our place in the world. And the thing that I'm going to be talking about a lot today is this idea of emergent patterns. It's this idea that if you collect enough natural history data and you bring them all together, you could identify some really cool trends and patterns that you might not be able to see looking at each of those observations in isolation. So natural history in recent years and in recent decades has been a little bit, people have been a little bit down on natural history. And I think a lot of this has to do with sort of the advent of a lot of genetic and genomic techniques that people are employing in the laboratory. Technology has advanced so rapidly, and the things that you're able to do with this technology. But I feel like that has sort of created this focus on a lot of sort of experimental approaches. So the idea that you manipulate a system really carefully, and you can get stronger inference and understand that system better that way. But I'm going to advocate today for the importance of natural history throughout this talk. And I think this is being reflected if you look at the scientific literature in several journals, such as the journal Ecology and American Naturalist, which are both very prestigious ecology journals, recently in the past few years coming out with sections dedicated specifically to natural history. So Ecology has a scientific naturalist, American Naturalist has natural history miscellany. And I think it shows this sort of increasing appreciation that in order to do the best science, you kind of need to bring together both of these different approaches, the sort of observational natural history approach and also the experimental approach. So the first thing that I'm going to be talking about today is a case study of how you can use a bunch of different natural history observations and kind of lump them all together and find some really cool trends about those behaviors. And we're going to focus on what I'm going to be calling disturbance foraging in birds, which I'll get to here in a minute. So to contextualize this, I want to touch quickly on the importance of ecological disturbance. Ecological disturbance is a fundamental part of most ecosystems. This can be anything like a big tree fall in a tropical forest to a wildfire or something like a hurricane. And generally, these disturbances introduce heterogeneity into the habitat, and they provide sort of more variation in habitat and often help to support more diverse communities of animals and plants. So I think when we think about disturbance, we often tend to think of this on a large scale, and specifically in terms of abiotic disturbances, disturbances in the environment, such as a hurricane, as I mentioned, or a tree fall. However, biotic ecological disturbances or disturbances caused by animals are also really important and can help structure species interactions and also animal communities. And some examples of this are these seabirds that you see here foraging around these whales. Another example, which is something that I've actually been really interested in studying and have looked at during my PhD and afterwards is army ants. So army ants are these ants that create these huge swarms in the forest in the tropics, and they attract all kinds of animals who feed at the swarms, and they eat everything in their path, and they're just an amazing sort of ecosystem engineer. And then another example is the famous tropical ornithologist Alexander Skutch, who recorded this sort of really cute anecdote of this ant bird, which he called Jimmy. Being a bird nerd, he named it after the genus Gymnopithys, so he called it Jimmy, following him around in the forest and eating the insects that he was kicking up out of the leaf litter. So these ecological disturbances caused by animals that occur at a smaller scale can also be really important. This idea of sort of animals foraging at the disturbances of other animals is something that was originally termed the beater effect. And this was coined by the naturalist Thomas Belt, who wrote a book about his times in Nicaragua. And that's when this was first sort of introduced into the scientific literature. And there are so many examples of this. I'm going to give you a couple here, but one classic example are double-toothed kites, which you see in Panama, where I did a lot of my PhD work, which follow around monkey troops to eat the food that the monkey troops kind of roust up out of the forest canopy. There are warblers that have been documented following armadillos, so maybe not necessarily an expected disturbance, but one nonetheless. And then, of course, one of my favorites, the largest rodent in the world, the capybara, which you see here with a cattle tyrant on its head who is hanging out with it and eating the insects that it's kicking up out of the mud. So I just want to do one quick example here. I'm just going to stop the share and then reshare. And I'm going to show you guys a video that I think is a great example of this sort of disturbance foraging behavior. All right. Let me see here. Here we go. All right, check this out.
Henry, I just want to check there's not supposed to be sound, right?
All right. Hopefully you guys saw that and heard that okay. I'm going to share again and get back to the PowerPoint.
So I'm gonna interrupt you for a second. We didn't hear any sound, but we could see the video okay.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
I'm not sure if, well, the next video doesn't really need a lot of sound, but it would have been better to have sound, but you guys get the idea, hopefully. Basically, it's a really interesting sort of foraging association between that you might never expect between these birds that are just hanging out, you know, kind of picking up all these fish that these dolphins are scaring out of the water. So I just think that, you know, thinking about this, I you know, got interested in this from studying army ants and seeing the birds that come to their swarms. And it just, there's so many possible interesting and unexpected interactions in the, as Darwin described it, the entangled bank of life. So that's kind of what drove me to sort of try to understand why this was going on. And so my colleagues and I decided to do a literature review in the scientific literature of this behavior, which we're calling disturbance foraging. And this is just sort of a histogram or a graph of how research on this topic in birds has increased over the years. So you can see that since the 50s, there's been this explosion in the number of studies that have been documenting these sort of interesting and sort of unexpected interactions between birds and the species that they are, the disturbances that they're following. And so that motivated us to try to understand some sort of emergent patterns about this behavior. First of all, we wanted to see if it varied geographically, if it occurred more in certain places than others. We also wanted to look at taxonomic patterns. So see if there were certain species or specific groups of birds that were foraging at these disturbances, or specific groups of animals that birds were responding to. And then finally, we wanted to look at what type of an ecological interaction is. Is this some sort of an interaction where both parties are benefiting? So what we call mutualism, where you have you know, both species getting a benefit. Is it a commensalism where only the birds are gaining the foraging benefit, or even potentially a parasitic relationship where the birds are stealing food from other animals? So these are the kind of questions that we wanted to address by accumulating all of these natural history studies together. And we did an exhaustive literature search, and we ended up finding 195 studies, 175 disturbing species, and almost 400 responding bird species. And this encompassed about 940 observations. And to be perfectly frank, this is a project that's currently ongoing, and we're still adding a little bit more literature. So I expect that you know, we'll increase the size of this data set even more as the final papers come in. But still, you can tell it's a very large data set to work with. And so I want to get into some of the results straight away. So the first question is, are there any geographic patterns? And what you can see here is you can see that this is a really widespread behavior. So a lot of those dots occur sort of in the band of the tropics, but you can see that this occurs on pretty much all of the large land masses around the world, including on many islands. So it just shows you what a widespread behavior this disturbance foraging is. If you look at this from a numbers perspective, what we find is that 90% of these observations occur in the tropics, which is a really interesting finding. And I'm happy to discuss afterwards if people have questions why I think that might be. But definitely some geographic patterns are emerging here. In terms of which animals are creating the disturbances that birds are responding to, we're going to take a look at some of these different groups here. And so the first group that you see, which is been recorded basically attracting the most birds, are terrestrial mammals. So terrestrial mammals, when you break it down and look at which species are doing this, a lot of them, most of them are artiodactyls. So a lot of bovine species like water buffalo, cattle, stuff like giraffes, which are also odd-toed ungulates. You have primates, so you have a lot of monkey troops and even great apes that are disturbing their habitat and attracting birds to forage near them. You have parasitodactyls like rhinoceroses and horses. And then you have this sort of trailing tail of a bunch of different, random species like elephants. But you also get species like tree squirrels, the bat-eared fox, which you see at the top right, and even stuff like the aardvark. So again, a really diverse suite of mammal species are attracting birds to forage next to them. And then lastly, I should also mention that humans are a non-trivial contributor to this as well. So For all of us who have seen birds foraging at a table, at a restaurant, or in some sort of urban environment like that, humans also attract a lot of birds to forage where we may leave food for them. Secondly, the second biggest group, which might be surprising to some, is arthropods, and this is exclusively due to the presence of swarm raiding ants. So there are two different kinds of ants in the New World. We have the army ants, which are form colonies of 500,000 individuals, and those are the ones that I've studied during my research. And then in the Old World, and specifically in the Afrotropics, we have the Doralus, what are called driver ants. And these ants have colonies that can get up to 10 million individuals. So they dwarf army ants in size, and they're paid much less attention to, but they also have been recorded attracting birds to their swarms. And so there's a very diverse host of birds that will go into these swarms, and they will wait there, and they will essentially go eat food that the ants are scaring up out of the leaf litter, because everything is fleeing their path. So really kind of interesting ecological interaction. If we take a look at birds, what we see is that generally non-passerine, so non-perching birds, are the ones that are creating the disturbances. So these are birds being attracted to other birds. And we see that the birds that are attracting other birds tend to be a bit larger, stuff like ibises, egrets, even up to the ostrich in Africa. However, we still do see some passerines like this starling here and this weaver, which are also attracting other birds, interestingly enough. When we look at aquatic mammals, we see that the majority of disturbances are caused by artiodactyls, such as hippopotami, or cetaceans, so whales, and they're closely related kin. But as I mentioned, there's even rodents like capybara and carnivores such as the otter here. So again, a really diverse suite of species that are creating these disturbances. Now let's flip the script a little bit and look at the responding species. So these are bird species that are responding to other animals creating disturbances in their environment. And we see here that the vast majority of these occur in one particular order, which are perching birds or passeriform. So these are small birds like warblers, sparrows, wrens, stuff like that. And these birds apparently have a major predilection for foraging at disturbances created by other animals. But the crazy thing is we found, and again, these are only anecdotal observations that we gleaned from the literature, we found that this was reported in over 50% of all avian orders and about 30% of all bird families. So just shows you the tremendous diversity of birds that rely on this foraging strategy, some or all of the time, to obtain food. Lastly, I want to look at body mass distributions of disturbing and responding species. So in terms of the species that are creating the disturbances, what we see here is it encompasses an incredibly broad range of body masses. So you just have body mass here. This is the log of body mass, which is why the units are a bit smaller on the x-axis, and then sort of the number of observations on the y-axis. And you see here that you get birds as small, these small birds over here, all the way up to animals like the blue whale that are attracting other bird species to forage next to them. If you look at birds, you can see this distribution is shifted to the left. So you can see that basically the birds are generally responding to larger species, and the birds themselves are smaller. But it's a bit deceiving, because if you actually look at this range of birds, this encompasses essentially the gamut of bird body sizes, all the way from tiny hummingbirds have been recorded foraging at disturbances to birds like the ostrich, one of the largest terrestrial birds in the world. So again, they generally respond to larger species, but you can see that birds of all body sizes are exhibiting this behavior. Finally, looking at what type of ecological interactions occurring here, we see that it's mixed. So you see that in a lot of the cases, you have what's called the commensal interaction, which is where the birds themselves are gaining a benefit and the species that they're foraging near aren't really affected by them. But you also see, and this is driven exclusively by army ant following birds, you see that a ton of these observations, and the majority of them, in fact, are kleptoparasitic. And that's because it's been documented that these birds actually steal food from the ants. So they reduce the ants' loot when they go forage at the swarm. So again, interesting to be able to combine all these studies and look at these emergent patterns. So what I've hopefully shown is that this is a really geographically widespread behavior that is more common in the tropics. And it is comprised of mixed interaction types, so commensal, parasitic, and also a few that are mutualistic. I've shown that army ants and terrestrial mammals are the species that are causing the most birds to be attracted to them. And I've shown you that the birds that are responding to disturbances are incredibly taxonomically diverse. And finally, disturbing species tend to be larger in body size than responding species. So hopefully you guys found that interesting. We're going to shift gears a little bit, and I want to focus in the second part of the talk on the importance of citizen science. So you guys are probably all familiar with the term citizen science. It's basically citizens doing science, so non-professional scientists. And I want to stress how incredibly important citizen science is for the advancement of science in general. So a couple examples here. These are just sort of cherry picked because I study birds, so I'm going to choose some bird examples. But one is the North American Breeding Bird Survey. So you kind of see this in this bubble here in the top right. And this was established in 1966. And it encompasses 4,100 survey routes throughout the entire country. And these data are collected by ornithologists, but primarily by skilled bird watchers. So again, this is sort of this massive citizen science effort that can be used to answer all kinds of scientific questions, and especially to look at population trends and monitor the health of bird populations in our country. Additionally, many of you are probably familiar with eBird, which is another sort of crowdsourced organization that collects data from birders and citizen scientists, and this is global in scale, and it can give you incredibly high resolution information on, for example, the geographic range of a species, the phenology, so essentially when are they migrating, what time of year, and other associated questions. So again, all of these things are citizen science initiatives. And if you look over the past 10 years, these are a little bit outdated, so 2009 to 2018, what you see here is just the number of citizen science studies that have been started. And this was created using this sort of repository called the SciStarter repository. So they just monitor citizen science projects. And you can see that they've actually absolutely exploded in recent years. And so all of these things sort of indicate exactly how much citizen science does to, that is important for moving the field of science forward. And so I want to pick another case study, or pluck another case study, maybe I should say. This is the paper that Alita referred to at the beginning of the talk. And this is a paper that I recently published with my friend Zach Sutton, who again is a member of the Audubon Society, and several of my collaborators, Mark Hauber and Jeff Braun at the University of Illinois. And this is about the importance of hair plucking behavior by birds. So as we're all familiar with, birds exhibit these incredible diversity in nest structure. So you can see the common miner on the top left, which make these sort of dome-like mud nests. You see the weavers in Africa, which create these massive, they weave these nests together and create these massive colonies. On the bottom left here, we see a nest of a bowerbird with all of its items that the male is using to attract the female. And then of course, a tiny little hummingbird nest. And so you can see the great diversity in nest structure. And this diversity includes the use of different kinds of nesting material. And so the adaptive significance of nesting material is clear because this is occurring in the nest, which influences both bird survival and reproduction, which are two key components of fitness. So what birds put in their nests has non-trivial impacts on their survival and reproduction. And so there's a lot of examples of different materials, such as hair or feathers. There's also snake skin, which has been thought to potentially deter predators. There are examples of birds including cigarette butts in their nests because they have antimicrobial properties, which is kind of a bit of a mind-blowing study that was published a few years ago. So again, what birds put in their nests has a strong influence on how likely the nests are to get depredated, and also how healthy their young are. So we're going to be focusing on hair in nests, and this is something that I'll talk to you about in a minute where this idea came from. But I have this question of how do birds obtain hair? And there are sort of three scenarios. The first one is that they get loose hair from the environment. The second one is that they collect it from dead mammals. And the last one is that they collect hair from live mammals, which might be sort of a surprising option. But thanks to our lovely Allerton Park, which is just a short drive away, we saw a really cool observation that sort of inspired this study. And so I was with Zach Sutton and Jeff Braun, who is a professor in NRES at U of I, and we were doing the spring bird count in 2020. And we were hiking around Allerton, and we had just finished the bird count. When we were leaving, we were walking out, and we saw this kind of blurry picture that you see here on the right. It's blown up, so it's a bit grainy, but this was taken by Zach. And Zach and Jeff noticed this bird behaving weirdly, this tufted titmouse. And when we looked a little closer, we realized that it was plucking hair from a sleeping raccoon. And so we were like, this is an amazing natural history observation. We're curious to see, how common is this and how often do birds do this? So we decided we were going to do another literature review, again, looking at these emergent patterns that I mentioned before of what we called kleptotrichy. So I'm a Latin nerd. I double majored in classics in college, and so I really like etymology and language. And so I made this term up myself. I kind of copied it off of a term that I'd seen in another paper, but it comes from the Greek klepto, steal, and trike, hair. So it literally means hair theft in Greek. So kind of a cool term. And we did a search using these subjects combined together in all different combinations to try to understand how common this behavior was among birds. So I just want to show you some of the pluckers, as I'll call them. And this is just a lot of the observations in literature we found were from the tufted titmouse, which is a common bird that we're probably all familiar with that lives here in East Central Illinois. But we also found some surprising other species. So we found that a starling was reported doing this, the red-winged starling, a species of crow, and actually multiple species of honey eaters, which you see here on the top right and on the bottom two panels as well, which is sort of an Asian/Australian distributed species. So again, they're all passerines, but sort of a diverse array of passerines. And when you look at the mammals that are getting the hair plucked, we found, again, sort of an interesting diverse array of mammals. So anything from squirrels all the way up to animals like cows and even humans, which you see here, and koala bears, of course, had to make them prominent in the middle there. So we combined all this information together and we found some sort of interesting emergent patterns. The first pattern that you'll see here is this is based on everything that we found. These are only 11 observations. So you'll see that this is not very commonly recorded in the scientific literature. We also saw that more than half of the observations were the tufted titmouse, which is the same species that we saw doing this behavior. We saw that in all of these recorded instances, mostly there didn't seem to be a response from the mammal. The mammal was either sleeping or didn't really seem to be bothered by the bird. There was one example of a Virginia opossum, which apparently didn't like it and was antagonistic towards the bird. But in general, they seem to not really care. So this is sort of suggests that this is what we call a commensal, or the birds are benefiting and the mammals aren't really affected. Doesn't really hurt a mammal to lose a few stray hairs. Sort of a commensal relationship. We also can see here, looking at the right column, that a lot of these sources are really old. So this was sort of back in the day when, this kind of observation was much more commonly published. And as I mentioned, in recent years, publishing a small natural history note, people might not want to put the time into that. They might want to spend more time focusing on a bigger project, or, they might not think it's publishable. And so in recent years, there haven't been as many observations. So this made me even more curious, and we decided that we were going to look in the popular literature, and we chose one platform, specifically YouTube. And we just used the same search keywords, and we looked on YouTube to see how many observations there were. And what we found was really amazing. What we found was almost 100 observations, so more than 9 times the amount of observations in the scientific literature of this behavior. We found that the vast majority were urban mammals, so humans and dogs were the ones that were getting their hair plucked. But we did find examples of other species in the Parid family, so the black-crested titmouse and the mountain chickadee, which were not recorded in the literature. And we found some really surprising mammals that were getting their hair plucked, including the spiny porcupine and cats, which are one of the main causes of mortality for birds. So this is, again, really, really surprising, and shows you how this sort of citizen science can go beyond the scientific literature at times and give you information that you might not find in the scientific literature. So I'm going to show you one video here, and I don't think we need the sound, but it's kind of cute, so I wanted to show it to you guys. So just give me a second and then I'll share it. One minute. All right. All right, I'll go back to the slides. So I just wanted to show you a little excerpt there, but this was one of the most common things that we actually found was that people were getting their hair plucked mostly by tufted titmice, interestingly enough. So if you guys are ever, looking to get a new do, maybe step out in the backyard and just be patient. And if you live in a forested area, you might get lucky, but really kind of funny. So after this, we also wanted to look at how commonly birds in the titmouse family incorporate hair into their nests. And so we did another search of Cornell's Birds of the World, which has detailed reproductive nesting biology information for most of the world's birds. It's a really good resource to use, and we looked specifically in the Parid family. And what we found was that of the 63 species in this family, 51 had nesting information available, and 86% of those use hair in their nests. So this is sort of just information that strengthens the case that this is something that might be occurring much more frequently than people realize, and especially than the scientific literature suggests. So in conclusion, I want to convey that citizen science is very important and your observations matter. If it's something from eBird, entering your checklist from your daily birding excursion, or just paying close attention and trying to find ways to get this out in some sort of forum, whether it's a scientific paper or a public forum, these observations are really useful. And so I just want to stress that most of all. In terms of this specific behavior, we found that it seems to be highly overlooked in the literature and is much more common in the bird watching and nature enthusiast community. And it seems to be occurring a lot in these urban areas. So it sort of suggests that if people went out more into natural areas, you might see this behavior more often than you'd expect. And we're probably it's probably more common in the popular literature because it's so easily observable in urban areas where humans are. And then finally, 85% of these birds use hair in their nests, which is kind of cool. So in terms of what I spoke about at the very beginning, this shows you how natural history can be used to generate future hypotheses. So some hypotheses that we're interested in testing based on this natural history compilation that we did is understanding how many species pluck hair, identifying more clearly the risk for these birds who are potentially putting their lives in danger, understanding where this behavior occurs and if it's more common in cold climates, because one of the ideas for why birds do this is to insulate their nests and keep their chicks and nests warm. And then finally, what is the function for a nest? So it's not only necessarily insulation, it could also be anti-predator or a variety of other possibilities. So with that, I will stop the talk, and I really appreciate you guys coming out, and I will take any questions. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Henry. So I'll invite folks to unmute themselves and ask questions directly, or you're also welcome to use the chat box if that's easier for you. I have 2 questions.
Sure.
Well, actually just one question. But yeah, so I'll start off, but then I'll also give it over to anybody else that maybe has questions.
Sounds good.
So my first question to you was, you mentioned that there were birds that were plucking porcupines.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about that?
It was one observation of, I think it was a tufted titmouse plucking hair from a porcupine. And it was, I actually didn't compile all the videos. Our collaborator, Sean McDonald, who got his master's at the university, was the one who compiled the videos. So if he were here, he could probably answer that better. But it was a tufted titmouse plucking hair from a porcupine, which is sort of mind blowing.
I would imagine porcupine hair is not the best material for a nest, but I guess if you're desperate, right?
I suppose so. And, it suggests that this is maybe it's a really important component of their nest, the fact that they're willing to go to such lengths. So again, something to be studied in the future.
Cool, and I'm glad to see that there was a feature of some South African birds, the red-winged starling, for example.
Yes, that's right, the red-winged starling. Good bird ID, 100%.
Yeah, and you gave me some ideas of birds that now might feature in the December talk. So, yeah.
Very cool.
So, does anybody have any questions? I also want to say that it's funny, I've never actually thought about it, but when you started talking, I grew up in a farming community, and oftentimes when it was either harvest time or when we were plowing the fields, there were fork-tailed drongos that actually actively like swept down behind the the machines. And so I guess that's similar to human disturbance as a
Absolutely, and we had some examples of that. So it's again, this is something that is probably way more common, but we were able to find a lot more observations for the disturbance foraging than the hair plucking. But we had numerous examples of birds foraging, like the picture that I showed you, foraging behind tractors. So it'd be an interesting exercise to do the same sort of popular literature search for the disturbance foraging paper, because I feel like you'd find a lot of material there.
And I'm thinking not even just, like in the long term, there must be some birds that capitalize on like ecological disturbances as well, like fires or things like that.
Yes. I think that's what originally got me into it was thinking of army ants, because army ants are this amazing ecosystem engineer that course through the forest floor. And if you've ever been in an ant swarm in the tropics, like everything is trying to get out of the way, and these birds come in and they pick off the insects and like frogs and stuff that are trying to flee from the ants. So and there are many species of birds that are obligate, or they exclusively depend on army ants for food. So it's not just something that happens occasionally. Oftentimes this can end up becoming sort of a really specialized behavior that they exhibit.
Super cool.
Have you any idea what percentage of their diet are these things that they're plucking, the insects?
That's a really good question. Hi, Beth. How are you? I think it depends on the interactions. I think a lot of the interactions are opportunistic and they just occur kind of randomly, and people happen to be there watching them. But other ones, like the army ants, are the best example I can think of. Is they're species that their entire life history is based on following these disturbances. It's not just, I mean, there probably so many other examples. Like we had a big tree fall at our plot in Panama, and we would put mist nets up and we'd catch birds to do a long-term study there. And the year after the tree fall happened, we caught like 4 species of hummingbirds we never caught. And it's because the hummingbirds were queuing into this, ecological disturbance on the landscape level. So I think whether it's biotic or abiotic, I think that there are many animals and birds in particular that do, they do depend on disturbances for, in the gaps, for example, the hummingbirds find their favorite food plants and they like sort of highlight environments and stuff. So I think it's a really important behavior that has, implications on multiple levels.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions, I want to say thank you again, Henry. This was a very, very interesting talk. Oh, let's
Hi,
see.
Henry.
Oh.
Hi, this is Suresh. Yeah.
Hey, Suresh, how are you?
How are you? Yeah, it's a fascinating talk you gave today. I really enjoyed your slides, and yeah, the animal behavior, especially the bird plucking the hair from the lady, that was like, I've never seen like that before.
Yeah, it's so crazy. It's there's I mean, people, and I'm curious to know, people here, and feel free to chime in, but I think it's commonly known in the birding community that if you put hair clippings out in your yard, and birds, especially titmice and stuff, will come and pick them up. So it's just so interesting how sometimes there's this disconnect between the science world and the popular science world. And I think that we need to constantly strive to bring those two worlds together.
And I also think, like, that the animals, the birds and the other animals, they are somehow connected to humans, because they feel, the bird, when it was plucking the hair from the lady, or, plucking hair from some other animals like the raccoon, they didn't even fear, like, they didn't fear for their lives, because they feel like it is the animal is there to help us. So maybe these birds are connected to other living organisms, like we humans and other animals, in some deep ways, that they think that we are all a part of nature. Or I think there is a bigger story behind all this, like the the creatures, the creatures of nature are so much interconnected, and the birds, they just do that without worrying about their lives, and that's another fascinating thing. Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, thank you
And
so much. I think it's great. It's so super interesting.
yeah. Have you also studied some, scavenging creatures like the vultures, the vultures and the big eagles? Because these creatures used to scavenge the dead bodies. I remember a time in Nepal when I was still young. There was a place in one of my maternal uncle's house where they used to throw the dead cows on the side of the river, and the carcasses used to be eaten by these big vultures, flying, hovering up from the sky. But in recent years, their population is like, is going down, and maybe, there is
I'm
a.
not sure. I'm not sure. I've never studied that personally. I'm not sure what the cause would be, but like that's, that system is really interesting too. How like social information is used to, find food sources and stuff like that. That's a question I'm really interested in as well. And I think there's so many different, interesting ecological interactions that need to be studied more deeply. There's also other examples are, like birds that, that like oxpeckers that like pick parasites off of, like larger mammals, for example. But they also, sometimes like take the blood from the mammals. And there's all kinds of weird, Darwin, I said at the beginning, he called it the tangled bank. And that's always really resonated with me. These sort of unknown or just kind of amazing interactions that are just right under our nose that maybe we don't even understand,
Yeah, and some of these creatures like the dogs and other animals, they also have the sensation, they have the perception which we humans don't really understand, like especially during the earthquake. These animals like the dogs, they know before humans know that there is an earthquake coming. So and the birds also, they make some weird sound, they start flying in a different way in the sky, and after some time, after 5 minutes or so, then we have a big earthquake. It happens.
Yeah, for sure.
And when Serge mentioned the vultures, I'm thinking our vulture population is way up, and I think it's because of roadkill.
Oh,
yeah,
that's interesting. But in some parts of the world, like in Nepal and in India, the population of vultures is diminishing because the carcasses, they are not finding the carcasses anymore, and their sources of food is going down. So we didn't see, maybe in the US, they are here more than in other parts of the world, but in Nepal, the place where I used to work before, there was some study going on why this population of vultures is going down. So it's another, I think there is a whole lot of other story to tell, like there must be some connections why this is happening. Thank you for sharing that. Anyway, great.
Of course. No, definitely. No problem.
This discussion also reminded me, we have a spider in South Africa that's called a haarskierder, which means hair cutter. And it's often used as a way to scare kids, of course, but also the name comes from the spider supposedly coming at night and cutting off pieces of your hair to line its nest with. So, but I don't know how true that is. Maybe a topic for a collaboration.
Interesting.
Yeah, it sounds awesome. Sounds very interesting.
Great.
So if there's no more questions, I want to say thanks again, Henry, and keep an eye out for the link, and we'll also share it through our listserv, which you can sign up for on our website. And I posted the link to the website in the chat as well.
Thank you, Henry.
Thanks very much, everyone, and I hope you all have a good evening.
And thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, your host, Alida.
Thanks for coming, guys.
Great. See you again. Bye.
Thanks so much, Alita. Thanks for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Henry, and I'll see you around. Hopefully, let me know once you're in town and you want to join the postdoc group.
Yeah, I'm in town now. Just shoot me an email, and I'll come out for a drink sometime or whatever you guys get together.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good.
All right, take care. Bye,
There's
Beth.
a Slack channel as well. If you want to join a Slack channel, we have a Slack channel. That's all right.
Yeah, that's very hip. Take
Cool.
care.
Good night.
Good night. Have a good night.